You've already treated this twice this month. The burning came back. You reached for what's in the cabinet. It eased. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a quiet thought, why does this keep coming back? That question is the most important one you haven't gotten a real answer to yet. Let me describe something, and I want you to listen for whether it sounds familiar, not just possible familiar. You feel pressure. Upper stomach, maybe behind the chest. It's not unbearable. It's just wrong enough to be distracting. You reach for something. Tums Pepsid, something with a name you trust from years of trusting it. It works. Within an hour, sometimes less, that pressure settles. You go on with your day. You go on with your week. And then, 2 weeks later, or 3 or 4, it's back. So you do what worked last time. 'Cause it worked last time. And it works again. And you tell yourself this is probably the coffee, or the pasta you had on Sunday, or the stress of the week. And sometimes that explanation holds until it doesn't. Until you've done this 5 times in a year, and each time there's a different explanation for why it came back, and you're starting to realize the explanations don't quite add up. That's the pattern I want to talk about today. Not the symptom itself, the pattern. I'm Nora, and I spend a significant amount of my time in the research most people don't have time to read. Not to make things complicated, the opposite. To translate what's actually happening inside the body into language that feels like something you could explain to a friend over coffee. That's what this channel is. If that's the kind of information you've been looking for, stay with me and subscribe if you haven't yet. Because here is what I want you to understand before we go any further. Not every stomach that burns is burning because of too much acid. That assumption is built into every antacid commercial, every drugstore aisle, every try cutting back on tomatoes conversation. And for a lot of people, it's accurate. But for a significant number of people, especially those over 60, that cycling pattern you just recognized yourself in has a completely different explanation. One that antacids were never designed to reach. I'm going to walk you through 5 specific signs today. And in the middle, I'm going to explain something about how this actually works inside the body. Because once you understand the mechanism, the signs stop feeling like random symptoms and start feeling like a coherent story your body has been trying to tell you. I want to give this a name before we go further. I'm going to call it the chemical shelter. Here's what I mean. Your stomach is one of the most hostile environments in your entire body. The acid inside it sits at a pH of around 2. If you want a reference point, that's roughly the acidity of lemon juice, sometimes stronger. That level of acid is lethal to almost everything that enters your stomach. Bacteria, viruses, food pathogens. The stomach was designed to destroy them. It's been doing that job for your entire life. So here's the question that should be sitting in your mind right now. How does a bacterium survive in there? Because Helicobacter pylori, the bacterium I'm talking about today, does survive in there. Not just for a few hours. For years. Sometimes decades. Inside one of the most acidic environments the human body produces. And the way it does is the chemical shelter. H. pylori produces an enzyme, a biological tool basically, called urease. Urease is the key to everything. What urease does is break down a compound called urea. Urea is naturally present in the stomach in small amounts. When urease breaks it down, 2 things are produced, carbon dioxide and ammonia. And ammonia is strongly alkaline, the chemical opposite of acid. The bacterium releases that ammonia directly around itself, creating a tiny pocket of neutralized, livable chemistry right in the middle of your otherwise lethal stomach environment. Think of it this way. Imagine your stomach as a room that stays permanently below freezing. Nothing survives in that room, that's the whole point. Now imagine a tenant who has somehow built a small, perfectly insulated shelter inside that room. The shelter maintains its own warmth regardless of what the room around it is doing. The tenant doesn't need the room to change. The tenant just needs the shelter to hold. That's H. pylori. It built the shelter with chemistry. and it maintains that shelter continuously and in real time for as long as it lives inside you. But here is the detail that changes everything else we're about to discuss. The ammonia that protects the bacterium is also toxic to the stomach lining. The same chemical that builds the shelter damages the tissue around it. That damage triggers your immune system to respond. And because the bacterium never leaves, the immune response never fully resolves either. It stays active. A low, constant, exhausting inflammatory response, running in the background of your stomach every single day. That chronic inflammation is where all 5 signs come from. Once you understand that, the signs stop being random. They become readable. Let's start with sign 1. And I want to be precise here because this one isn't a sensation, it's pattern. Think back over the last 12 months, not the last 2 weeks, the full year. How many times have you treated some form of stomach discomfort, felt meaningfully better, and then needed to treat it again? 3 times? More? If that cycling pattern sounds like yours, here's why it happens. When you take an antacid or an acid-reducing medication, you're changing the environment of the stomach. You're lowering the acid. The inflammation that was responding to the ammonia damage becomes slightly less acute. Your symptoms quiet. You better. But the bacterium is still there, still producing urease, still generating ammonia, still triggering that immune response. You haven't touched it. The medication never reached it. And as soon as the medication wears off, as soon as the stomach chemistry returns to its normal state, the inflammatory response reasserts itself. The symptoms come back. You haven't treated the problem. You've temporarily adjusted the conditions around it. And then those conditions return. And so does everything else. The cycling pattern, relief, return, isn't your stomach behaving badly. It's your body telling you that whatever you've been treating isn't what's actually driving the symptoms. Sign 2 has to do with location. Classic acid reflux, what most people call heartburn, tends to produce a burning sensation that moves. It starts in the upper abdomen or lower chest and climbs toward the throat. It gets worse when you lie down after a meal, or when you bend forward. Most people know this feeling well. Pylori discomfort tends to sit somewhere different. The location is the upper abdomen specifically, the area between your navel and the lower edge of your breastbone. Doctors have a name for this area, the epigastric region. The sensation there is usually described not as burning, but as gnawing. A dull, aching, fluctuating pressure. Something that feels a little like hunger, but isn't quite right. And here is the detail that matters most. H. pylori-associated discomfort frequently eases when you eat, not worsens. Food buffers the inflammatory environment temporarily. It changes the chemistry in your stomach in a way that quiets the irritation for a while. But 1 to 3 hours after eating, when the stomach begins to empty and that buffer fades, the discomfort returns. If you've ever found yourself reaching for crackers at 10 at night, not because you were hungry, but because something in your stomach settled when there was food in it, that's worth noting. Your body was solving for something. The question, what? Sign 3 is the one I want to slow down on, because it's significantly underreported. I think it's the one most likely to have been dismissed by you or by someone you talk to without a second thought. Mild nausea in the morning. Not dramatic. Not vomiting. Just a quiet low-grade unease in the first 30 to 40 minutes after waking. A faint reluctance to eat breakfast. Sometimes a slightly acidic or metallic taste in the mouth. Sometimes nothing more specific than a sense that the idea of food is just wrong for the first hour of the day. Most people over 60 attribute this immediately to sleeping position, or to age, or to just how mornings are now. But there's a documented connection between H. pylori infection and morning nausea, specifically in the fasting state. After 7 or 8 hours of sleep, the stomach is empty. There's no food to buffer the chronically inflamed mucosal lining. The ammonia damage is unmasked. The inflammatory environment is most pronounced. The stomach is essentially signaling its distress in the quietest moment of your day, the one where nothing else is masking it. The body was whispering. And for a lot of people, it whispered for years before anyone listened. So why doesn't this get caught? Part of the answer is access. Antacids and acid reducers are some of the most purchased over-the-counter products in this country. They're available at every pharmacy. They work within the hour. They create a very believable narrative. I had too much acid. I treated it. It went away. That narrative is satisfying. It's clean. It doesn't require a doctor's visit or a conversation or a test. And most of the time, in most people, that narrative is accurate, which is exactly what makes it so easy to miss when it isn't. The second part of the answer is attribution. Every time the symptoms return, they return in context. There was something you ate. There was a stressful week. There was a night you didn't sleep well. And so the symptom gets explained away by whatever was most recently present. The pattern across 12 months is invisible if you're only ever looking at the most recent 2 weeks. You can explain away any single episode. You can't explain away the pattern, unless you're willing to look at the whole year at once. The third part is this. H. pylori is often not on the list of what gets considered first. Standard care for recurring digestive discomfort tends to start with acid suppression, and acid suppression does reduce symptoms, which like success, until the symptoms return, and then it looks like a flare, and the cycle continues. This is also the point where I want to say something directly. I can't tell you exactly what's happening in your body. Only your doctor can do that, with a proper history and a proper test. But I can tell you what's happening in bodies like yours, so that when you do have that conversation, you're not starting from zero. You're starting with a pattern, a question, and a specific thing to ask for. Sign 4 is one that almost everyone over 60 attributes to aging and moves on. Early fullness. The sensation of feeling satisfied, or more than satisfied, after eating far less than you used to. You sit down to a meal you would have finished easily a few years ago. Halfway through, your appetite closes. Not nausea. Just a clear signal that eating more would cross from comfortable to uncomfortable. So you stop. And you tell yourself this is just how things are now. And here's the truth. Gastric function does change after 60. Digestion slows. Appetite owns shift. The stomach's mechanical behavior evolves over time. Those are genuine, documented changes. They're real. But early fullness is also a documented feature of H. pylori-associated gastritis, which just means inflammation of the stomach lining specifically. When the mucosal lining is chronically inflamed, the stomach's ability to expand and comfortably accommodate food is affected. The signals that regulate fullness become disrupted. The stomach sends the full message before it actually is. The problem is that this is just getting older, and this is a sign of a treatable infection, can look identical from the inside, which is why isolation is the wrong frame. No single sign points clearly anywhere on its own, but the pattern, cycling symptoms, epigastric discomfort that eases with food, morning nausea, early fullness, that pattern is a different kind of conversation altogether. Now here's where I want to connect something you might not have expected. H. pylori infection doesn't just affect the stomach in isolation. Chronic, low-grade inflammation, the kind that runs for years, has a way of spreading its effects outward. There is documented research linking long-standing H. pylori infection with iron deficiency anemia. Here's why. The chronically inflamed stomach lining is less efficient at absorbing certain nutrients. Iron absorption in particular depends on a specific acidic environment and a healthy mucosal lining. When that lining is damaged, and has been damaged for years, the body's ability to pull iron from food can decrease. Iron deficiency doesn't always look like obvious exhaustion and paleness. Sometimes it looks like a fatigue that just lives in the background, A heaviness you've learned to work around. A low energy ceiling you assumed was just your baseline now. If you've had your iron checked and been told it's a little low, or if you've been told you have anemia without a clear explanation for why, this connection is worth raising with your doctor. There's also a less obvious sign. Sign 5. An unexplained change in appetite, specifically a persistent decrease in interest in food that isn't explained by mood or anything else you can clearly identify. Not depression, not a stressful period of life, just a quiet drift away from food that has lasted for weeks or months. This can happen because chronic inflammation affects the hunger signaling system in ways that go well beyond the stomach itself. The gut and the brain are in constant communication through a pathway called the gut-brain axis, essentially a two-way highway of nerve signals and chemical messengers running between your digestive system and your brain. When the gut is chronically inflamed, that communication gets disrupted, and one of the things that can shift is appetite itself. Your gut and your brain are in a constant conversation. When the gut is inflamed for long enough, the brain starts getting different messages, and appetite is one of the first things to change. Your digestive symptoms and your general sense of not being quite yourself are not always separate problems. Sometimes they are the same problem, showing up in two different places. Here is the thing I want you to carry forward from everything we've just covered. Recurrent digestive symptoms are not a personality trait. They are not something your stomach simply developed a preference for. They are not the inevitable price of too much coffee over too many years or a constitution that was always a little sensitive. For a significant number of people, and current estimates suggest somewhere between 30% of American adults carry H. pylori with rates higher in people over 60, those recurring symptoms are the surface signal of an infection that has been living inside the stomach lining for years, decades in some cases, maintaining its chemical shelter, causing ongoing damage, triggering a chronic inflammatory response that never fully resolves because the thing causing it never leaves. That is a fundamentally different problem than excess acid production. And this is the part that I think deserves real emphasis. It requires a fundamentally different solution. Antacids and acid reducers are not the wrong answer because they're bad medications. They're the wrong answer for this specific problem because they were never designed to reach a bacterium embedded in the stomach lining. They treat the environment around the infection. They do not treat the infection. This isn't a stomach that produces too much acid. This is a stomach that has a tenant it was never meant to house, and no antacid will convince the tenant to leave. The reason this matters so much, particularly for people who have been cycling through this pattern for years, is the question of what cumulative, untreated inflammation does over time. Chronic H. pylori infection is associated with a higher risk of peptic ulcers, sores that form in the stomach lining or the upper part of the small intestine. In a smaller number of cases, long-standing infection has been linked to changes in the stomach lining that can, over years, become more serious. I'm not saying this to alarm you. I'm saying it because the gap between manageable discomfort and something worth testing for and treating is smaller than most people realize, and because testing for this is straightforward, non-invasive, available through a standard doctor's visit. Once you understand that the cycling pattern, the epigastric gnawing, the morning nausea, the early fullness, and the background appetite shift are all expressions of the same underlying mechanism, the chemical shelter, you cannot look at them the same way anymore. They're not separate annoyances. They're a coherent story. And a coherent story has a coherent explanation. And an explanation this specific is something you can walk into a doctor's office and ask about by name. Let me be specific about what you can actually do, because talk to your doctor without any further information is the part where most advice stops being useful. Ask specifically about H. pylori testing. You do not need to arrive with a diagnosis. You need to arrive with a pattern and a question. That pattern is what we've been building together for the last 20 minutes. The question is, I've been noticing a cycling pattern of digestive discomfort over several months. I'd like to ask about H. pylori testing. That is not catastrophizing. That is being a precise and effective advocate for your own health. Your doctor cannot act on what you don't say. The two most accessible non-invasive tests are the urea breath test and the stool antigen test. Both accurate. Both are available through standard primary care offices. Neither requires a hospital visit or a procedure. The urea breath test is worth understanding specifically because it tests for the mechanism I described. You swallow a compound containing a specially labeled form of carbon. If H. pylori is present in your stomach, its urease enzyme will break that compound down, and the labeled carbon will appear in your breath when you exhale. The test is essentially asking your stomach, is there something in there running the urease reaction right now? It's simple, it takes about 30 minutes, and the result is direct. One critical piece of preparation. If you are currently taking a proton pump inhibitor, these are the stronger acid suppressants, medications like omeprazole, pantoprazole, or esomeprazole, sold under names like Prelosec, Protonix, and Nexium. Tell your doctor before you test. These medications can suppress H. pylori activity enough to produce a false negative result. The bacterium is still there, but it's quieted enough that the test misses it. In most cases, your doctor will advise pausing the medication for 2 weeks before the breath test so the infection returns to its normal level of activity and becomes detectable again. Skipping that step is one of the most common reasons this infection gets missed even when someone does get tested. Know that, you go in. If your symptoms are more severe, if you've noticed any of the warning signs I'm about to mention, an upper endoscopy may be recommended instead. A procedure where a doctor can look directly at the stomach lining and take a small tissue sample if needed. The information from that is definitive. Warning signs that mean don't wait. Everything we've discussed today, the cycling pattern, the gnawing discomfort, the morning nausea, the early fullness, those are reasons to raise H. pylori at your next scheduled appointment. But if you have experienced stools that are persistently dark, black, or tarry, that requires evaluation without delay. Dark stools can indicate bleeding in the upper digestive tract. It doesn't always mean something catastrophic, but it always means something. Similarly, vomiting that recurs, nausea severe enough to interfere with eating or daily function, unintentional weight loss of several pounds over a few months, difficulty swallowing, or unexplained iron deficiency anemia. These are reasons to make the appointment this week. The distinction matters. If H. pylori is confirmed, it is treatable, not something to manage indefinitely. Treatable. With a specific, time-limited course that, when followed completely, can eliminate the infection. The standard approach uses 2 antibiotics given at the same time, combined with an acid-suppressing medication. The 2 antibiotics are used simultaneously because they attack H. pylori from 2 different biological angles, making it significantly harder for the bacterium to survive or to develop resistance to the treatment. The full course runs 10 to 14 days. And here is the one thing I want you to commit to before starting. Do not stop early because you feel better. Symptoms often improve significantly within the first few days of treatment. The inflammation quiets. The discomfort recedes. It can feel like the problem is solved. But H. pylori can survive partial antibiotic exposure and become resistant to the same antibiotics in the process. Stopping at day 7 because you feel well at day 7 may leave behind a surviving population that is now harder to reach the second time. Finish full course. Then, and this matters just as much, confirm eradication with a follow-up breath test or stool antigen test 4 weeks after completing the antibiotics. Give your stomach the complete window to heal and confirm that the infection is actually gone. One thing about natural approaches, because I know this comes up and I want to be honest with you, no dietary change or supplement will eliminate an active H. pylori infection. Manuka honey, mastic gum, garlic, broccoli sprouts. There is genuinely interesting preliminary research on some of these compounds, but the evidence in living human stomachs does not show the clinical efficacy to clear an established infection. If you delay testing and treatment in favor of a home protocol, you are giving the bacterium more time. That's the honest version. What nutrition can do is support the healing process. Fermented foods with live cultures, plain yogurt, kefir, have some evidence suggesting they reduce antibiotic-related side effects and may modestly improve eradication rates when used alongside standard treatment. Not instead of. Alongside. Antioxidant-rich vegetables, adequate fiber, and reduction of ultra-processed foods lower systemic inflammation, which matters when your stomach lining is actively rebuilding itself. Good nutrition supports recovery. It does not replace treatment. That line is simple and it's worth holding clearly. I want to end where we started. That familiar pressure. That reach for the cabinet. That quiet return a few weeks later. There's a word for that pattern. And it isn't aging. It isn't stress. It isn't an overly sensitive stomach. For a real and significant number of people, it is a bacterial infection that has been living in the stomach lining, maintaining its chemical shelter, producing its daily damage, cycling through your body's attempts to quiet it, for years. Quietly, persistently, responsive to treatment you've never been offered, because no one has stopped to ask the right question yet. The 5 signs we walked through today are not meant to frighten you. They're meant to give you precision. Enough specificity to sit down with your doctor and say, with actual words, I've noticed a cycling pattern. I want to ask about H. pylori testing. That's it. That's the entire shift. Because the body has been communicating this whole time. The question has never been whether the signals were there. The question is whether anyone taught you to read them. Your symptoms aren't random. They're a pattern. And a pattern this consistent has a name, and a name has a test, and a test has a treatment. If this conversation opened something up for you, the video posted before this one connects directly to what we've been talking about, because the overall burden of toxins and heavy metals in the body affects the gut environment we just spent 30 minutes discussing. It's called the #1 vegetable that flushes heavy metals out of your body after 60. Worth your time if you haven't seen it. And if you'd like to keep having conversations like this one, the kind that start with a pattern you recognized in yours and end with something concrete you can do with it, subscribe. That's what this channel is here for. I'll see you in the next one.